Hi everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. It's really good to see this topic on your agenda. 4 years or so ago, after I left government and began looking at the problem of insider threat in the commercial sector, it was actually quite hard to get people to think about this subject. Companies either told us they didn't have a problem, or they told us they might have a problem but didn't think it was that important, or they definitely did have a problem, but they thought that the risks of dealing with it were bigger than the risks of living with it. Things have changed a lot since then, which is obviously good news for us, but above all, it's good news for organisations who are keen to keep their businesses safe. But before I plunge into all of that, a quick word first about who I am and why I might have been asked to speak to you today. So my name's Susanna Berry, and I spent 30 years working in the Foreign Office in the UK and overseas. After messing around with foreign diplomacy for a couple of decades, I got involved in looking at how we could harness behavioural science in the pursuit of our foreign policy and national security objectives. One of the areas that this took me into was the topic of insider threat and how we could make sure that our people at home in London or serving overseas in our embassies didn't become motivated to do their organisation and their country harm, either for their own private reasons or because they were being coerced by a third party, like a hostile state or criminal or terrorist groups. These things did happen from time to time, but I'm afraid I won't be talking too much about that today. After I left the Foreign Office, I spent a year or so completing a PhD that I'd been gestating for the previous 10 years. My thesis was on undercover policing and deception. It was the culmination of a long interest in a niche research area that I guess you could describe as being sneaky and getting away with it. It's an area of research that is highly relevant to the management of insider threat. Since finishing the PhD, I've been working with Blacksmiths Group, looking at insider threat, both in the private and government sectors. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, first of all, and with apologies to the organisers, I am going to subvert the title of the talk a little bit. The thing is, I don't really think that solving the insider problem is mostly about spotting insiders, although this does have its place, and I will talk about it because I did, after all, promise to. There's a bit of a tendency for people to think about insiders the way you might think about burglars or maggots in an apple. They're an intrinsically bad thing, and as long as you keep them out, you're not going to have a problem. But this misses the fact that, generally speaking, insiders are not born bad. They're made bad by the things that happen to them. Most people who decide to do harm to their employer or their country don't join the organisation with the aim of doing so. It's what happens to them later, after they've joined, that turns them bad. This has some obvious implications for vetting and screening that I'll talk about later. But, with apologies for the spoiler alert, my message will be that while knowing how to spot an insider in an organisation is definitely helpful, it's even more helpful to know how to stop people becoming insiders in the first place. But in addition to talking about spotting insiders, I'll be touching on a couple of related areas. The first of these is trust. People often see trust and insider threat management as somehow antithetical to each other. A lot of clients tell us that they'd love to do something to identify actual or potential insiders in their organisation, but they can't, because if they do, they'll undermine the culture of trust that exists in the organisation. I'll be arguing that it's possible to keep trust and verify in balance. If you're smart, you can harness your existing organisational trust to enhance your insider threat management programme, and also to use your approach to insider threat management to build and enhance trust. And if you fall asleep for the rest of the talk, please do wake up for this bit, because it's one of the most important parts. The second thing I'll be talking about is insiders and security design. Security experts will tell you until they and you are blue in the face that humans are the weakest link. Just about every cyber conference I've ever been to, someone has stood up and said this, and I'm starting to get quite scratchy about it. And with apologies to anyone who might have made this claim today, in a single system in which humans and machines interact with each other, it is not the humans that are the weakest link. It's the design error that allows or encourages a person to do the wrong thing. In other words, if there is a stupid human, they're outside the system and not in it. So before we go into all of that, let's make sure that we all agree what we're talking about here. So here's a definition of insiders that we usually use, adapted from one used by CPNI, the Centre for the Protection of the National Infrastructure. And it goes as follows. An insider threat is the potential for an individual, whether staff or contractor or supplier, who has or has had authorized access to an organization's assets, to use their access either maliciously or unintentionally to act in a way that could negatively affect the organization. You'll notice a few things about this definition. One is that the definition is not confined to staff, but extends to all the people who might have authorized access to your critical assets. That could include contractors, but it could also include suppliers and partners. It's very tempting for companies that make the decision to tackle insider threat to confine their efforts to their staff. It's clean and simple. It feels like the obvious risk and the one that people would expect you to do something about. But as we'll discuss later, that's a mistake. You'll also notice that the definition refers to unintentional or malicious acts. Now, this is a useful rule of thumb distinction, but I don't think it really captures the subtlety of how insider acts actually take place. Let's think about the overworked employee who has to send some sensitive encrypted material outside the organization after working hours. The system they have to do this isn't working. The IT support guys have gone home, and the boss expects it to be sent today. Fed up with the long hours, and probably fed up with the boss too, the person decides to send it unencrypted, perhaps in a way that they think won't be picked up by IT security. Their actions are intentional and negligent, but they're not actively malicious. Or take the senior MOD official in a period of crisis. He's been in meetings all day and his inbox is full of highly sensitive briefings that he needs to have read by tomorrow. It's 8 p.m, he's tired and hungry, there's no food on site, and he has a 90-minute journey home. He knows it's not allowed, but he prints out the secret documents, rams them in his backpack, and takes them home to read. Next day, as he runs to the train in the morning, they fall out of his backpack and they're discovered by a member of the public. Again, not malicious, but not exactly accidental either. So I think we need to think about the malicious unintentional thing, not as binary, but as a spectrum of behavior with totally accidental and unwitting at one end, totally calculating and malicious at the other, and in between acts which are deliberate and well-intentioned, as well as acts which are negligent and indifferent to the consequences. Finally, CPNI talks about acts that could negatively affect the organization. Now, if you think about it, that's drawing the net pretty wide. It potentially takes in a huge range of different acts: theft, fraud, whistleblowing, sabotage, workplace violence, and so on. It would include Edward Snowden, Nick Leeson, Andrew Skelton of Morrison's, Major Nidal Hassan of the Fort Hood shooting, and the German wing pilots who committed suicide by deliberately crashing his plane. All of these people used their access to their organization's critical assets to do it harm. You could argue it would also include Harvey Weinstein, Robert Maxwell, and Bernie Madoff. So we're talking about many different kinds of perpetrators, many different kinds of acts, many different kinds of target, and many different types of motives. So what does that mean in the context of spotting insiders, which is what you all want to know about? Well, it means it's difficult. Insider threat is a very heterogeneous phenomenon, which manifests itself in a whole raft of different ways. There's no single profile, and so, I would suggest, no single diagnostic. And examples of individual types of insider act, such as IP theft or workplace violence, may occur quite rarely in any given organization, which means it's difficult to get a large enough sample of cases to predict what your future insider risk might look like. We had this problem in government. We were always putting in place controls to catch the last insider, not the next one that was coming down the track, who, guess what, looked quite different. And this small sample size problem means that technical solutions that promise to take away your insider problem using a set of pre-programmed or machine-learned indicators are probably offering you false hope. unless they relate to a very narrowly defined type of activity, such as insider trading. From the point of view of one-size-fits-all technical solutions to spotting and ejecting insiders, this heterogeneity is a problem. But from the point of view of understanding and managing insider risk, you need to understand and embrace it. And this is because although the people who become insiders and the actions they commit may all be very different, many of the root causes of their actions are the same. And they often reside in the organization itself and its culture and its processes, rather than in the individual. The other reason you need to think about insider risk holistically is because different types of insider acts have a tendency to feed into each other. Let's think of the member of staff who's badly bullied by their boss and whose case is poorly dealt with by their organization. Under huge amounts of stress, they make a serious IT security mistake, or perhaps they give in to the temptation to speak out of turn about the organization in social media. Harm is done to the organization, but who was the insider in this case? Was it the bullying boss, or was it the employee? Or let's think about the department with a weak security culture, where accidental or negligent breaches go unnoticed and unpunished. What an easy environment for the malicious insider to operate in. I've been struck in the last couple of years by how the FCA has begun to emphasize more strongly the importance of having a good organizational culture. And I think this represents a recognition that good conduct in one area breeds good conduct in others. So why do insiders do what they do? These are the things that people usually talk about: money, resentment, moral injustice, or ethics, or ideology, or whatever you want to call it, and coercion. But my experience is that it's very rarely about any one of these things in isolation, despite what the victims say about it, and despite what the perpetrators will tell you. I have a real problem with those pie charts that tell you that 37% of insider acts were financially motivated, or 15% were motivated by ethical concerns, and so on. I mean, my motives for choosing my breakfast cereal in the morning are more complex than that. You only have to look at Edward Snowden to see how complex insider motivations can be. Snowden was someone who, by his own admission, was deeply resentful about his treatment by managers and colleagues. Arguably, he had pretty good reasons to be aggrieved by this, but he also probably got more worked up about it than most of us would. Alongside his personal grievances, Snowden was also very keen to stress, probably genuinely, that his actions were motivated by lofty ethical concerns, invasion of privacy, betrayal of trust, and so on. Quite where the personal grievance ended and where the ethical grievance began is hard to pin down, of course. And I always think that trying to assess the motives of insider acts is very like trying to assess the motives of terrorists through a really, really complex mix of personal and environmental factors. Often the person themselves don't really know what their motives were, and in the end, one man's insider act may be another man's moral crusade. And it's the ambiguity of motive that can make spotting the insider a particularly challenging task. Even incidents involving theft and financial fraud may not be as simple as they appear. Employment screening often focuses on people who are in financial trouble, on the assumption that these are the ones who are most likely to steal. But I wonder if this isn't a rather crude approach. Money is very rarely just about money. It's almost always about something that the money represents psychologically, perhaps self-esteem, or how you're being measured against others. Often, financial crimes are motivated and justified in the person's mind by the sense that they've not been getting their fair share, or they're not valued and respected enough. We even heard MPs making a version of this excuse during the expenses scandal. And interestingly, we found in government that even when it was really about actual financial need, in other words, stealing money to buy stuff, it was often money that people needed to help someone else, perhaps to fund a child's education, for example. Perhaps this is because people find it morally easier to justify stealing money for someone else than stealing it for themselves. As you might expect, we get quite a lot of stable door business, companies who've just had a data breach or a major fraud or some other event that has made them wake up and smell the inside of coffee. And what's interesting about these is that as soon as you start talking to people about what happened, they say things like, yeah, well, we all knew there was something not quite right about him, or, well, I can't say I was all that surprised when I heard. And perhaps it's this phenomenon that leads a lot of people in this business to claim that you can always spot insiders. Well, I'd agree with those people up to a point. I think it is pretty easy to spot insiders retrospectively, the changes in behaviour, the days off, the poor timekeeping, the stress, etc. But that is not the same thing as every guy who comes in late or every person who goes off on one on a Monday morning being an insider. And so this means we need to be really careful about using so-called indicators of insider behaviour predictively. So let's look at the factors which have been shown to increase the likelihood of an insider act occurring. And please note how I phrased that. It's not quite the same thing as spotting an insider. There's been a lot of research done in this area. Historically, this has tended to concentrate on the personality traits of insiders, but latterly, most experts have come to see insider activity as a pathway, which typically involves the convergence of several different factors. The slide on show now illustrates a pathway model. As well as the antecedent factors like personality and experience, we often also see a trigger event for an insider act, some relatively minor incident that has the effect of sending the person off at the deep end. But please do bear in mind in all of this what I said earlier about the heterogeneity of insider acts. Factors that are relevant for one type of insider act may be less relevant for others. So what are the important factors then? Well, first, certain personality types do seem to be more susceptible to committing insider acts than others. Second, many insiders seem to experience what psychologists call major life events in the 2 years or so before they commit their acts, events such as bereavement and divorce, although it can also be positive events such as marriage. Third, organizational factors play a really important role. Companies with poor line managers, unfair HR processes, bad security culture, and frequent organizational disruptions like M&As will have a higher than average number of insiders. And it's also worth mentioning demographic factors. The overwhelming majority of insiders are men. Now, perhaps this is a base rate phenomenon. Perhaps there are just more men than women in organizations with access to critical assets. Or maybe women are nicer and more trustworthy than men, or maybe they're smarter and not getting caught. I don't know. Age is also an interesting variable. If we go back a couple of decades, insider activity seemed to be most associated with a disillusioned middle-aged man. Now it seems to be associated with a much younger age group, and maybe this is something to do with the social changes in attitudes to employment, or perhaps it reflects the fact that the people who have the technical skills to do a company real harm are generally younger. So I'm going to talk now about personality and insider threat. And this is a bit that everyone finds really sexy, but the bit where I get a bit squeamish as a social scientist. The thing I do have to stress here is that there is a lot of it depends in all of this, and that the personality traits I'll talk about are not per se predictive of insider threat. They may simply heighten the risk of insider activity under some circumstances, particularly if they're not well understood and managed. So, having said all that, and putting my queasiness aside for a moment, let's kick off with one personality trait that is actually pretty damn likely to cause you problem in most circumstances. Narcissists. Well, the great thing about narcissists, in fact, really the only great thing about narcissists, is that they're the source of some of the best jokes in psychology. And if you were not lucky enough to spot that you had a narcissist on your hands at interview, you're going to find out pretty quickly. Narcissism has a very distinctive set of characteristics and a really disruptive one. At its extreme, it's a clinical condition, which you can diagnose through the use of clinical tools. Unfortunately, these are not the kind of tools that will be available to you in a recruitment context. Narcissism is one of a group of 3 negative personality traits: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism, that has been nicknamed the dark triad. There's quite a lot of overlap between these traits, and collectively, they're characterized by things like lack of empathy, lack of trust, manipulativeness, cruelty, self-aggrandizement, insensitivity to others, and hypersensitivity to criticism. Although they're often charming and charismatic, narcissists do tend to leave a trail of destruction behind them, particularly in their relationships with other people. These are the people who will love you to death, and then they'll turn against you suddenly and viciously. And you only have to look at the trail of advisors that Donald Trump left behind him for an example of this behavior. Narcissists crave admiration, and they respond extremely badly if they don't get it, or if people criticize them. They're also arrogant and domineering, and they tend to create their own realities, a kind of force field which they suck other people into. They have highly distorted worldviews, and so they often find it difficult to process or accept information that doesn't support reality as they see it. However reasonable and well argued that information is, narcissists have quite a distinctive verbal and written style, and perhaps the most obvious example of this was Donald Trump. Early in Trump's presidency, a group of American psychiatrists conducted a remote assessment of him, diagnosing him as a narcissist on the basis of a number of things, including his use of language. Things they pulled out included his disproportionate use of superlatives, best, highest, greatest, loudest, stupidest, etc. I've added a couple of examples to this slide from Kanye West. One of the other things you'll find is that narcissists really struggle to give credit to other people, or even to talk about other people. They'll turn the subject as soon as they can to the subject they like the most, me. It's not hard to see, is it, how this type of behavior could give rise to disharmony in the workplace, and you'd think it might be pretty easy to spot in a job interview. But oddly enough, it's harder than it should be. Part of the reason for this, I think, is that as a society, we've created a social norm out of bigging yourself up and talking about your own achievements. And of course, that is exactly what we're inviting people to do at interviews. But there are a couple of things that you can look out for that do distinguish the person who is presenting their best self, plus a bit, from the outright narcissist. Narcissists are so self-confident and self-regarding that they won't back off a subject, even when they're in the presence of an expert who knows a lot more than they do. Narcissists are also so self-absorbed that they won't bother trying to ingratiate themselves with an interviewer in the way that most interviewees will. And as you would expect, narcissists will have a really hard time giving credit to anyone else in the team that they worked in. I love the following quote, which summarizes how you can identify a narcissist. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. If it walks like a duck and talks like a swan, it's probably a narcissist. Intellectual arrogance. So this is a trait that has quite a lot in common with narcissism, and it plays out in similar ways. Disparaging other people and their opinions, having a contempt for people who they see as less smart than they are, and a desire to be right all the time. It can also manifest itself in an inability to engage with people at an emotional level, and a tendency to bring everything back down to cold, sterile intellectual argument. As you might expect, intellectually arrogant people are actually usually genuinely pretty smart. Intellectual arrogance can be particularly problematic when it's combined with a belief that the interests of a person's specialist subject or academic discipline supersedes all other interests, including the person's obligations to their employer. And this is a problem we see quite often in organizations with lots of scientists and researchers who may see the pursuit of their research and the esteem of their research colleagues as being much more important than their commitment to the company. This, of course, can make them susceptible to offers from people who flatter them and promise them freer scope to pursue their interests, for example, commercial competitors or even foreign states. And we've seen this vulnerability exploited by the Chinese intelligence services, who have induced Western scientists working on sensitive projects to hand over material in the interests of scientific collaboration. The case of Charles Lieberman, a Harvard professor in nanotechnology who passed US military secrets to the Chinese, is a good case to look at for those who are interested in this. Like narcissism, intellectual arrogance can be difficult to spot in an interview when someone is genuinely clever and you're asking them about all the great stuff they've done. But I'd suggest that you make efforts to find out whether the person actually has a sense of proportion about the work they're engaged in, and see the extent to which they're willing to give credit to other people working in their field. An overdeveloped sense of mission. Strong sense of mission, why wouldn't you want that? People who will go the extra mile, work longer hours, and be willing to make large personal sacrifices for the company. You see this sort of behavior a lot in high-stake environments like the police and the military, but also in tech startups. Often, companies like these are driven by people with powerful and inspiring visions who ask a lot of their people, motivating them with the idea of being involved in something special and unique. But of course, the more fired up people get and the more sacrifices they make, the more scope there is for them to become disappointed and disillusioned further down the track. I worked with a guy a few years ago who had a sense of mission that was off the scale. He was put onto a job that involved giving close protection to a person who for a period of time was under threat. His role in protecting that person grew larger and larger because of the amount of time and effort and expertise that he was willing to put into it. He worked round the clock and refused to take leave. Later, the threat was assessed as having receded and protection resources were withdrawn. But Jim didn't agree with this decision, and like a valiant St. George, he refused to be taken off the job. His behaviour ended up embarrassing the organisation and putting the person at greater threat than they would otherwise have been. In more everyday situations, employees like this can become disillusioned if their company betrays their stated mission or values in some way, or if it gives up on a core defining activity, particularly if the person concerned has been personally involved in that activity. I guess some of the problem that Google has had with its staff comes down to a perceived gap between its activities and its informal motto, "Don't be evil," which of course it dropped a couple of years ago. And Tesla's also quite interesting in this respect. It seems to have had several insider incidents that are linked to its perceived failure to live up to its environmental commitments. And if you look at Glassdoor, you see quite a lot of Tesla employees talking about regretting having gone that extra mile for the company. Quirrellers, another problematic group. We all know people like this, people who obsessively nurse their grievances, who can't let go, and who spend disproportionate amounts of time trying to get perceived wrongs righted. It's an obsessive behavior, and it will generally show up both in and outside the workplace. These are the people who are constantly tied up in battle with HR, having legal disputes about fences with their neighbours, or complaining to the council about something. They can tie up huge amounts of an organisation's time and effort and can become resentful and vindictive if they're thwarted. Typically, they'll also try and enlist the support of colleagues in their grievance, causing all sorts of collateral damage in the process. Again, this characteristic takes a little skill to get at in interview. But the thing to remember is that these people are so obsessed with their grievances that they can't resist the temptation to moan. So getting them to talk about how they've dealt with past injustices should probably get at it pretty quickly. Of course, what you're interested in here is not whether or not the person has suffered an injustice at work, because of course many people will have done, but how that person has processed it in their mind. Linear thinkers. Linear thinking is a cognitive style rather than a personality trait, and it describes the way that people perceive and process information. It's characteristic of people working in professions like engineering, technology, and accountancy. Linear thinkers are logical, methodical, and systematic. They've got a strong grip on detail, and they're really good at creating and understanding complex systems. They tend to solve problems using a single discipline or frame of reference. On average, though, they do also tend to be less socially skilled and less empathetic than lateral thinkers. Lateral thinkers, by contrast, are more flexible. They use a range of approaches and frameworks to solve problems. They make connections between different ideas and reference points, and they do tend to be better at seeing the human dimension of a problem. Now, neither of these thinking styles is right or wrong, but they may be better adapted to some environments and some types of problem than others. Because organizations are often run by lateral thinkers, linear thinkers can end up being seen as problematic and different, making them feel out of step with the mainstream culture of the organization. Linear thinkers also deal less well with change, and they may struggle to get their objections heard. I don't know if anyone's ever seen a hilarious hidden gem of a film called Office Space, which is basically all about insider threat, but it features a highly linear thinker called Milton, who ends up burning down his company's headquarters because they make him move desk. Low conscientiousness. So finally, lack of conscientiousness is a characteristic that has few upsides. And of all the personality traits you can measure, it's actually the one which is most predictive of success or failure in the workplace. As you'd expect, people who are low in conscientiousness will make more mistakes, they'll work less hard, and they'll perform less well all round. They will demotivate the people around them, creating resentment because they don't pull their weight. And from an organizational point of view, if you don't address careless and negligent behaviors by people like this, they will affect the way that other people behave too, and this will undermine your security culture and your work ethic. In all likelihood, job candidates are not going to tell you that they're lazy and underperforming in an interview, but you may be able to gain some indication of this from their CVs, or ideally from speaking directly to their referees, if this is an option. You'll have spotted that although one or two of these characteristics are unambiguously undesirable, many of them are actually quite double-edged. If you're running an accountancy company or an engineering firm, you're going to be employing a lot of linear thinkers because they're going to be really good at the job. Similarly, if you're employing a high-powered sales team, there's a chance that some of them are going to be borderline narcissists. And if you're going to be recruiting people into a team of top scientists, you'll be recruiting some pretty smart people. And there's a good chance that some of them may even be intellectually arrogant. So you're not necessarily going to be looking at screening these people out, but you do need to be thinking about how serious a risk they could pose and how well equipped you as an organization are to manage that risk. I'm constantly struck and concerned by the degree of faith that HR departments put in screening. The screening processes carried out by most organizations are fairly lightweight. And of course, though they will tell you a little bit about what someone has and hasn't done in the past, they don't tell you anything about what they might go on to do. We did a piece of work recently with an organization where the HR department told us that they didn't really need any insider threat management measures because they had good entry screening and they only employed good people. It became quite clear after really not very long that this was not actually the case. The organization had had a recent incident where a female employee who'd worked in the finance department for 20 years had suddenly started to redirect payments into her own personal account. It took the organization quite a long time to figure out what was going on, even though HR and welfare were aware that the person was going through some personal difficulties. I think it's important to remember that the person you recruit may not be the same person 5 or 10 years later, and that to believe that people are either good or bad and have no capacity to change in either direction is, I think, a little bit naive. In government, we spent a huge amount of money and effort on vetting, but to be honest, we never really knew if it was working. As my colleague who worked as head of security at GCHQ will tell you, people vetted to the very highest security levels still stole money from the honesty bar. But of course, you can never know the counterfactuals. Perhaps it would have been even worse if we hadn't put people through vetting. But interestingly, when vetted government servants did commit insider acts, it was very rare to find that there was something in their distant past that had been missed by vetting when they joined. More often, their acts could be traced back to something specific that had happened since they joined the organization. Of course, we also had ongoing vetting in government, and this did often succeed in picking up the early warning signs that something was wrong. I have a pet theory, which may be complete nonsense, but which does have some basis in psychological theory, that vetting may be effective, but not necessary for the reasons we think. In government, thanks to the national security exemption, we were able to put people through more intrusive vetting than takes place in the private sector. Very few people resented this because it was what we'd signed up to and because they knew why it mattered. But oddly enough, from a psychological point of view, I think the fact that we were subject to these checks may actually have had the effect of making us behave better, not just because we thought we'd be found out if we did anything wrong, but because having gone through these hoops successfully and having been let into the organisation, we felt we must somehow merit the trust that was being invested in us. In other words, by putting their trust in us, the organisation actually made us more trustworthy. It's a principle that has been shown to work with difficult teenagers, although as someone who's had teenage boys, I'm not sure I'd want to put all my eggs in that basket. But having done quite a lot of work now with companies who are subject to the SMCR regime, I have the impression that a similar process may be at work there as well. Which brings us to that topic of trust. As you will by now have realised, I think organisations need to be trying to spot insider risks, not just at the point that the person comes through the door, but on an ongoing basis. This might include carrying out rolling screening checks, training line managers to be alert to the signs of psychological distress or changes of behaviour in their staff, and potentially technical monitoring measures. A lot of organisations get very anxious about this and are reluctant even to have the conversation with their staff about insider threat, fearing that they may be accused of acting like Big Brother. But if you have that conversation openly and honestly, and critically, if you explain the link between staff welfare and insider risk, I think most people are more than capable of understanding why you would want to identify and support staff who are in trouble and prevent them from harming themselves, their colleagues, the organisation and its clients. And I'm quite often struck by how when we go into companies, particularly regulated companies, we find that staff are generally much more relaxed about the idea of monitoring than the senior management are. Having said that, there is no doubt that it's much easier to introduce insider threat detection measures earlier in an organisation's life than later. There is a risk that if the comms are not handled right, your staff will wonder why it is that you trusted them yesterday, but you don't today. And introducing new physical and IT security measures to guard against insider threat is much, much harder than having them in place from the outset. But of course, when new companies start out, insider threat is usually the last thing they're thinking about. Money may be tight, and they're probably going to want to spend it on developing the product and getting the right people in with the right skills. Often, the founders are a bunch of mates who trust each other, and as they take on new staff, they may apply what we in Blacksmiths call a no plonkers policy. They recruit nice people that they think they'll be happy working with and that they think they can trust. But there comes a tipping point when the company gets too big for you to handpick people in this way, and where people don't know each other personally anymore. And at this point, you've just lost one of your most important insider threat controls, the ability to spot when things are going wrong with a member of your staff because you know them all. So by this point, and ideally significantly before, you need to have in place some more formal measures that enable you to identify and manage threats from your people. Why do I say significantly before? One of our first contracts when I joined Blacksmiths was with a young and extremely successful company that did algorithmic trading. They were about 50 strong, and the two CEOs, good mates and both maths geniuses, were still handpicking their staff, but they were about to grow, and they knew this wasn't going to be possible for much longer. They also knew that they owned some really valuable IP and that they very much needed to protect. And they had some really smart people, some of them with exactly the sorts of character traits that we were talking about earlier. But I was still quite puzzled why it was that they'd invited us in, as companies of this kind are not usually that focused on insider risk, even though they should be. We did a bit of research, and it turned out that the worst had actually already happened to them. It was originally 3 mates, not 2, who'd set up the company, but things had gone sour with the third. Putting the pieces together, he seemed to have been reluctant to give up his academic research activities, and as a result of this, he'd shared information with fellow academics in a way that put the commercial viability of the company at risk. Having learned that lesson the hard way, the two of them were anxious that this should never happen again. If, like the company I just mentioned, you have valuable proprietary information, or you're developing a technology that could make you the target of a competitor or a hostile state, or even a political protest group, you should really be thinking right from the outset about how you protect your staff and your data. Put the right controls, processes, and rules in place right from the very beginning, and explain to your people why you're doing it and why it matters. Doing this early will make them more aware of the need to protect your critical assets. And it can also be helpful, of course, when you're seeking additional funding and pitching new investors. Aside from the obvious cybersecurity controls, we would urge you to focus at an early stage on information classification and on mapping the job roles in your organization in order to understand which ones provide most access to sensitive assets, and also on training your staff in security awareness. Security awareness training needs to go much deeper than the mechanical spot the phishing email exercises that so many organizations seem to rely on. And it needs to give employees a sense of the why as well as the what. And ideally, training should be designed to be relevant to people in their home lives as well as their work lives, as this helps to reinforce understanding and commitment. I promised that I'd talk about the importance of designing good insider security into your processes and systems. I noticed a claim in a recent study by IBM that 95% of cyber breaches are due to human error. But are they really? And when is human error human error? I was at a theatre a couple of years ago, and during the interval, I walked down a flight of steps to join my husband at the bar, and I inexplicably stumbled and fell on the last step. "You idiot," commented my husband unsympathetically. Physically and psychologically bruised, I sat and watched other people coming down the steps, and I noticed that about 1 in 5 of them stumbled as I had. Looking more closely, I saw that every step had a band of dark tape on its outer edge, except the last one, so inattentive and short-sighted people like me missed it and fell. For me, this falls into the category of what human factor experts call frequently made errors, or FMEs. And where FMEs occur, you need to stop blaming the people and start thinking about how you can design the feature in question so it doesn't just work for the smartest person on their smartest day, but for every person who uses it. A few years ago, in my former government department, someone in the IT department decided to introduce a great new feature into the email system, which enabled you to send a message to everyone in the directorate at the same time. This was sensible because previously the process had been very burdensome. The new feature involved clicking on a version of the director's email that was in bold. They didn't, of course, bother to tell anyone they were introducing this feature, and I'm sure you can already see the problem. At the end of a long and tiring day, I sat down to send the director an email about the sensitive personnel issue that was going on in the directorate. I'll never forget what I called it. The title line read, "Trouble in the Woodshed." As I clicked in the addressee field, my director's email address came up in bold. That's a bit odd, I thought, as I blearily clicked send. Immediately, a whole raft of out-of-office messages came up, and I realized I'd sent this message to about 150 people. "Bother," I said. "Research has shown that even your best informed and smartest staff will still do things that put the company at risk if your processes motivate them to do so. If you force people to change their passwords every month and you don't give them sensible advice on how to do it, they will change their password, but probably from password to password 1. Designing good systems is about understanding how people process the costs and benefits of the decisions they make in any given situation. If an employee knows that their boss values getting the job done over keeping the organization safe, well, they'll take a security risk to get the job done, even if they are breaking the rules. And if a person sees that their boss isn't wearing their pass, they are, of course, meant to challenge them. But the benefits of doing this, a marginal increase in security for the organization, are massively outweighed by the costs, social embarrassment, and the risk that your boss will hate you. There's no point people in security wringing their hands about the fact that people don't do the right thing if they don't create the incentives for them to do so. Good design is not just relevant to preventing accidental insider acts, but it's also important to preventing deliberate insider acts as well. Some people will tell you that if someone is determined to commit a harmful act, they'll find a way to do it no matter what. We know that's not true. Back in the 1970s, one of the most popular methods of suicide for women was to put their heads in the kitchen oven. It was quick and painless, and importantly, it wasn't disfiguring. Then, town gas, which contained carbon monoxide, was replaced by natural gas, which didn't, and the rates of suicide among women plummeted. People were really surprised, as they assumed that if someone was desperate enough to commit suicide, then they'd be motivated to find another way. But we now know that for suicide and for criminal acts and for insider acts, that opportunity is at least as important as motivation. You may be wondering why there's an image of the Golden Gate Bridge on the screen. It's another example of how when measures are taken to remove the opportunity to commit suicide, in this case putting up barriers, the number of suicides dropped sharply. It's up here, of course, because there aren't many good images for natural gas. Poor security design not only increases the opportunity for a person to commit insider acts, but it can actually actively incentivize them to do so. We know that many insider acts take place in response to a minor trigger following a period of accumulated anger and resentment that tips the person over the edge. In the case of Edward Snowden, the trigger was being asked to apologize to a senior. But for some insiders, it will be the piffling process that takes an hour out of your day, or the poorly designed expenses form that keeps getting sent back. I'm going to end this talk by sharing with you some frequently made errors, not the kinds that your employees make at their keyboards, but the errors and biases that we frequently see when we work with organizations who have started to think about their insider threat. The first of these is where organizations see insider threat as being all about verify and not at all about trust. And we call this the Mike Ashley approach to insider threat. It's really attractive to think that you can buy a piece of monitoring kit, for example, and run it across all your systems, and that this will capture some indicators, do some sums, and spot your insiders for you. You can certainly do this, and it will probably tell you some stuff, but you need to ask yourself a few things. Do you know what the indicators are that you need to be capturing? Who's looking at the outputs of this kit, and do they know how to interpret it and what to do with it? How much time is being spent following up alerts that turn out to be nothing at all? What aspects of your insider risk is this capturing? Is monitoring information being successfully put together with other relevant information from other parts of the organization, from HR, for example? And what effect does the use of monitoring technologies have on your staff and your relationship with them? If your use of monitoring is not part of a broader conversation about supporting people who are in difficulty and about making sure that everyone is invested in keeping the organization safe, you may find that it actually does more harm than good. I suspect that the Sports Direct workers who were put through 15 unpaid minutes of physical searches as they left the warehouse felt a lot more like stealing the trainers when they went out than they did when they'd gone in. The second of these FMEs is the exact opposite. Organizations who see insider threat as all about trust and not in the slightest about verify. We've already touched on this, and as I've mentioned, it's the default approach for many new companies. The argument here goes that as long as you recruit the right people and you're nice to them, then they'll do right by you. If this is a deliberate and well thought out strategy, then I do actually have some time for it, because I think that treating people well does actually go quite a long way. But it's risky, because it's almost inevitable that at some point, someone you recruit will, for some reason or other, become a threat to you. And if you have nothing in place to spot when this happens, then you may end up in trouble. The third FME is something I call the genuflection bias. I have to admit that I made the name of this bias up, but it's essentially what happens when you make a token gesture to address a problem by tackling only one aspect of it, and then you go away with the feeling that you've solved it, it's job done. It's the approach my son takes to washing up, and it's also the approach that many companies take to dealing with insider threat. Faced with the complexity of the problem, this is perhaps not surprising. We often find that companies respond by deciding to deal with one selective component of their insider threat, usually the one that feels most salient to them. So, for example, organizations may decide to put threat controls around their staff, but do nothing about their contractor workforce, even though their contractors have exactly the same level of access to sensitive material. And we're also seeing a lot of companies who are not putting enough effort into managing the insider threat from their supply chain, even though they know perfectly well that suppliers have become the soft underbelly for attacks from criminals and hostile states. If I'm honest, I think that there's sometimes a bit of a tendency for people to do those things that they know they'd be expected to do as part of their job, rather than the things that will actually do most to protect the organization. The fourth FME is to fail to assign insider threat accountability in the organization, or to assign it to the wrong part of the organization. Insider threat is a team activity which needs to bring together information and insights from many different parts of the organization: IT, physical security and estates, risk and audit, legal, HR, and so on. Ultimately, however, insider threat is intimately tied up with staff well-being, and so it needs to be led by HR. And it's also HR who hold most of the levers that can be used to manage it. The fifth and final FME is measuring the wrong things. Having good data from across the organization is obviously really critical to understanding your insider threat. But when you try and measure something complex and intangible like a threat, there's a really human tendency to measure the things that are easy to measure and not the things that tell you most about the phenomenon. Phishing exercises are a classic example of this. We see organizations spending a lot of time on these exercises and using the data they get from them as a gauge of their insider risk and their security culture. But many phishing emails have become really clever. So the fact that people fall for them doesn't actually tell you all that much about their security sophistication or their attitudes to security. I would argue that measuring the number of people in your organization who click on a phishing email tells you no more about your accidental insider risk than counting how many bunches of flowers your husband brings you to measure how much he loves you. These are a few of the poo traps that you can avoid if you're trying to get your arms around your insider threat. But the biggest takeaway, as I've tried to get across, is that prevention is a lot better than detection. And I hope I've persuaded you that spotting insiders is not all about spotting bad apples, but mostly about managing the risk that some people may go bad in some situations. This means turning the spotlight not just on the employee, but on the organization itself, its management practices, its design features, and its culture. That is not to say there's no such thing as a bad apple. There is, but it's probably not going to be your main risk.